Okay. So we have George with us. He decided to pump up the volume and like do some music for you. Well, yeah, more or less. So I'm more theatrical announcement, but yeah, he will deliver. Don't worry. And yeah, George is actually Nash. I mean, he has connections to Serbia, to say. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, more or less, yeah. So yeah, like enjoy the show and prepare to ask questions like for bots and of course rate him afterwards. So George, you can start.
Hvala puno. All right. Thank you everyone for coming today, and I want to thank HeapSpace for having me at Vox Days Belgrade today. I'm going to talk today about, well, three things really. I'm going to be talking about JavaScript, an old music protocol called MIDI, and a category of devices I just call tiny computers. That's things like Raspberry Pis, Arduinos, single board microcontrollers, and single board computers, basically. The reason I'm talking about these three things is they are a really fun and sort of interesting combination of tools we can make to make really sort of creative, clever, and fun things. All of the other talks that have been here today, you know, we've had a lot of talks about, sure, you want to check something? Okay, no problem. Nema problema. Da? Hvala. Where was I? Yeah, so there have been a lot of wonderful talks here today, a lot of things on microcontrollers and AI and chatbots and all kinds of things. A lot of, you know, very impressive companies like Google and whatnot are here. Probably a lot of things you might be able to take back to your work or your job and actually apply. I can promise you there's going to be none of that in this talk. You know, if you do take something away from this and use it in your job, please email me because I'd like to know what you do for a living. A little bit about me. I think it's good to humanize developers sometimes. You may not always remember what's in the talk, but if you remember one or two things about the person, maybe it helps you remember later. Oh yeah, my name's George. Here are all the various ways you can contact me. I'm kind of boring online because it's just my name over and over and over again. I've been a freelance web developer for about 11 years now. I'm from Portland, Oregon in the US. I think in JavaScript years, it's like about 194 years, depending on how you look at it. Sorry, my screen was dimming. I forgot to turn that off. So like I said, I think sometimes it's nice to humanize developers and throw up a couple fun facts at the beginning. Just might help you remember aspects of this talk later. As Milos said, I have some roots here. My grandfather was Serbian. It's a really long story. I've been staying with my relatives this week. I haven't been hungry in days. It's an effort just to be up here and not fall asleep. I lived as a digital nomad for a year and traveled through 18 different countries once. It was kind of an interesting experience. I was born in Saudi Arabia. That's kind of unusual and also a very long story. I have a family history of long, odd stories and whatnot. My most known project is about as frivolous as this talk I'm giving in some ways. Has anyone heard of Konami.js? I'm really curious. Sometimes I get one or two hands. Once I got like 10 hands, it really surprised me. It's a really silly JavaScript Easter egg script that I made about 10 years ago that lets you enter the Konami code on a website and then stuff happens. And for whatever reason, it caught on like wildfire and people love it, and I still sort of maintain it to this day. And if you Google my name and look at things I've done, it makes me laugh that that's probably the thing that shows up at the top. And last, I once unintentionally cheated while running in a marathon in North Korea. I don't advocate cheating in general, but if you're going to do it, I would recommend maybe doing it in other places. Okay. Oh, and that's a screenshot from that project I mentioned a moment ago, Konami.js. Marvel used it, Newsweek used it. You entered the Konami code, and all the articles changed the things about zombies. And on Marvel, that guy popped up over the thing. Anyway, more relevantly, I really like to make things. Specifically, I like to sort of break things. I like to push my tools to the limits of what they were intended to do and find ways to repurpose them in fun and, you know, to me, interesting ways. That kind of brings us to what I'm going to talk about today. Before I dive into it too much, I'd actually like to start with sort of an interactive experiment, if you guys are willing to do that. Most of you I know have phones. Do people have, does anyone out there have their computer as well. It should work on your phone, but I'm a little more confident when people have their laptops. Okay, so I'm going to throw a website up here. And we're going to do a little interactive experiment. I'll make that a little bit larger. Okay, so if you guys go to that website, I'll wait a moment. Should start to see people show up in a minute. There we go. I got 2 people in the orchestra. 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 6 is enough to start doing something. So for those of you that have connected, this should be pretty clear on the little page. Go ahead and turn your volume up so that we can hear what's about to happen, maybe. Okay. That wasn't quite supposed to happen that way. I'm not sure why the audio is coming out over there. Well. Oh, unless I have it open in the other window? No, I don't think so. Well. Was anyone hearing that on their device by chance? All right, well, I'm going to skip that and move to the next one. That is unfortunate. Okay, this one. Given the way that first one just went, I think I might just skip this one. There's plenty of demos going on at the end. We can talk about it later, and I can tell you what that first one was supposed to do if you're interested. So what we're talking about today, we're talking about JavaScript, obviously. Talking about tiny computers, like I sort of defined that up front. And we're talking about MIDI. A quick show of hands. Who's familiar with MIDI or thinks they know what that is? Okay? So probably, I'd say most of you, half of you maybe. I don't know. It's kind of hard to guess crowd sizes sometimes. Usually the people that show up to this talk are people that are somewhat familiar with that and are curious. So MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Device Interface. That's not really the most important part or really the clearest naming convention. So before I dive into that though, so why did I choose JavaScript in MIDI? Well, JavaScript is everywhere these days, as you all know. It's on the client side, the server side. We use it to make chatbots. We use it to do deep learning. We use it to make AI or whatever we choose to define as AI. We do it. It can be found in the Internet of Things. We can find it in embedded technology and the hardware level. It's just literally everywhere. It's kind of the lingua franca of web stuff these days, for better or worse. Maybe mostly worse, but you know, it's there. It's where the people are. This is what I tell people. People sometimes ask me, like, what's my opinion on this and that about JavaScript? And I go, well, to be honest, like, it almost doesn't matter what I think about it, because it's, for better or worse, like I just said, that's where everyone is. It's where everyone, not everyone, but it's where a lot of people are. And a lot of development is happening. And you kind of have to go where the people are if you want to stay relevant and build these, you know, modern tools. The asynchronous nature of JavaScript is actually a really nice fit with the way the MIDI protocol wants to work. We'll touch on that when I talk about MIDI, the protocol, in a moment. But it's kind of amazing how seamlessly and naturally the way we write asynchronous JavaScript code meshes with the way that MIDI just wants to behave naturally. I mean, it's not a very complicated protocol, but it's interesting only because the protocol was written back in 1983, and so it predates JavaScript by a fair amount. So why tiny computers? To be perfectly honest, I probably could have given this talk without touching on tiny computers and single board controllers, but I really just like them. I think they're a lot of fun, and there's a lot of interesting stuff being done in the hardware and JavaScript space these days. You know, we have Raspberry Pis and Arduinos, which people know about, but we also have Esperinos, which allow us to actually run the JavaScript code on the hardware itself. This little clicker that I'm using is actually not a run-of-the-mill clicker. It's a tiny Esperino computer called a Puck. And I've written a little JavaScript program that interacts with my slideshow. I can go forward, I can go back. And if I feel like maybe something didn't go over very well, I can make myself feel better by... Oh, wait, did you hear that? Oh, okay. I couldn't hear that very well from up here. I need it one more time. There we go. Okay, thank you. That is the that is the cheapest applause anyone has ever gotten. I'm embarrassed for you guys, man. Like I said, tiny computers are lots of fun. So why MIDI? MIDI it's a few things. So the name is sort of used interchangeably to describe a lot of things. It's used to describe the protocol, which allows electronic musical instruments to speak to one another. Kind of like some I have up here on my stage, which you'll see a little later on. It's also a standard. It's kind of in this gray area. So it's the protocol that allows the machines to speak together. That's MIDI. But the definitions that define what these different numbers mean musically in terms of a performance, that's also called MIDI. That's the MIDI standard. And then there's sort of a third one that more people are familiar with, especially if you were doing computers in the 90s before MP3s kind of exploded. For whatever reason, I remember MIDI files, MIDI, music as a MIDI file format being a somewhat popular thing. And I find when I talk to people about this, they use all those very interchangeably. So I just want to point out up top, it's kind of three different things. And we're mostly today talking about the protocol and how we can communicate with that, because that's the most interesting part. It's not this. It's like chintzy MIDI music from the 90s that came with your computer back in 1995. Or this. Or this. The funny story about this one, this guy was actually an intern at Microsoft, and one of his jobs was to write a song for, I think, Windows 98 that year when it came out, and it's still out there. So MIDI, the protocol, allows electronic musical instruments to communicate with one another, like I said. It can also describe common instrument performance parameters, like turning a note on, turning a note off, bending the pitch in the note, doing some other sort of instrument level changes to the performance or something like that. Another quick show of hands, I'm curious, how many of you are musicians? There was a lot of MIDI hands that went up, but I'm curious how many musicians are here. Okay, a few less. There's always a few. There's a pretty decent overlap between the sort of developer community and musicians, usually. And so the MIDI standard, I have this slide up here just because I think it's interesting that the way it's maintained is not terribly dissimilar to, excuse me, to how standards are maintained in our industries. There is a group of people that get together and they decide on things and they vote. And to this day, they're still making changes and discussing the MIDI standard, which is, interesting because it's been around since 1985. And the MIDI file format, really all that does is it describes a sequence of MIDI events. When one electronic musical instrument talks to another one, it's sending a MIDI event to that other instrument or that computer. A MIDI file is basically just a cascade of all these events describing when they happen and what combination they happen. It makes me think of an old player piano, maybe like this, or maybe more modern, maybe a visualization kind of like this that looks a little like Guitar Hero or something. Yeah, so why do I like MIDI as a tool for making creative and interesting things? First of all, it's asynchronous, which is kind of fun. It talks to hardware. It doesn't just talk to modern hardware. It talks to hardware that goes back to 1983. I can go to a music shop and buy a keyboard with MIDI support, and with a special adapter, just plug it into my computer, and I can start talking to it and making curious, interesting things. It's also surprisingly really easy to use for non-musical applications, and that's where I'm going to go with this. Oh, this is the really cool thing. So Chrome natively speaks to MIDI through JavaScript. There is a MIDI API that all of you, if you have Chrome on your computer right now, can use. I could plug in any of these devices up here on my screen into any of your computers, and they can start talking to one another. We don't need special drivers. We don't need special plugins. You just write a very short little web page that asks for permission, and you can start writing interactive web pages that communicate with MIDI devices. And so like any sort of derivative of, I should say, Chromium really would work. So Chrome, Chromium, Electron, those sort of things. They all support MIDI right out of the box, which is really cool. I have this slide in here because I just thought it was funny. I was wondering the other day, I'm like, I wonder what, like, you know, it's like, can I actually use web MIDI if I wanted to on a web page that has 59% global coverage? It's not a particularly useful stat for anything, but I just want to throw that up there. So let me talk a little bit about MIDI controllers, or better known as MIDI instruments. There are lots of pre-existing USB-ready modern MIDI controllers like the ones I have up here on my stage. A lot of old hardware, like I said, can be repurposed to connect to your computer and start talking to Chrome or JavaScript, however you want to do it. And you can even build your own, like I've sort of done here with this Esperino. You can even get more close to the hardware if you want and start building one using Arduinos and breadboards and that sort of thing. There's a wide range of like how deep you want to go into it. If you just want to have a simple device that has a couple buttons and dials on it and you want to start making something on your computer that interacts with the real world, you can go buy this and plug it in and it's ready to go. If you want to buy every single component and solder it together and wire it all up and put it in a custom case, you know, you can do that too. Like there's many ways you can like choose to engage with this. And I have some photos up here on the screen. There's a little keyboard. That was actually the first MIDI the first keyboard that supported MIDI, I believe, pretty sure. That's the one I just showed you a moment ago. This guy, I've actually got this down here. This is designed to be stepped on. I've actually, oh no, this one stopped working. That's sad. I forgot about that. Anyway, yeah, this is just 3 buttons that I can have on the floor and start interacting with. This one's a lot heavier, so I tend to leave that one at home, and I don't want to check into my luggage. This one, I don't have this one with me, but it's sort of it acts kind of like a volume knob that you can step on and rotate with your foot. And there's a lot of interesting interactions you can do with that. This one could detect how hard you bite on the mouthpiece and how hard you're blowing into it, like a flute. This one is actually an accelerometer. I'm actually wearing it on my hand right now for a demo I'm going to show you in a little bit. It has an accelerometer built into it, and the X, Y, and Z axes are mapped to MIDI. They send MIDI messages for each of those different axes in the accelerometer, and it's kind of an interesting device to play with. And does anyone know who this guy is? I'm curious. Nobody? Okay, that's kind of what I thought. I mean, in the mid to late 80s, he built his own MIDI controller, and he was kind of ahead of his time. And I was looking at homemade MIDI controllers and remembered this guy and just wanted to throw that slide in there. And like I said, you can build your own, which is a lot of fun. So I'm going to do a very brief technical dive into the anatomy of what a MIDI message actually is. The beauty of the MIDI protocol is that it is dead simple. Like, it really just boils down to 3 numbers. And although the MIDI standard has decided like what those numbers correlate to in terms of like, you know, this sequence of numbers means this note is on, this sequence of numbers means this note is off, this sequence means you've pressed this number this hard. You know, at the end of the day, they're just numbers. And because of that, you can repurpose these things to make really fun interactive stuff that has nothing to do with music. And that's actually where my interest lies in this, is making non-musical creative things out of mostly music hardware and a really old music protocol. So a MIDI message is 3 bytes. The first one is a status byte. It tells us kind of what's going on. And then the other 2 tell us a little bit more detail about that event that is going on. So when I say status, I might mean like, you know, I'm pressing this button right now, and the button is depressed. And so that first byte would tell whatever other thing that the controller is communicating with, hey, this button has been pressed. The other 2 pieces of data would tell it which button and maybe how hard I pressed it, or some sort of aspect. That kind of depends on the controller itself and how it's set up. Status byte always begins with 1, and data bytes always begin with 0. And that means it's not actually 3. We don't actually have 3 8-bit bytes. We have 3 7-bit. Well, actually, we have 2 7-bit bytes of information to deal with as far as variability goes. Because the status message, those first 3 bits, first 3 bits are dedicated to telling us what the event is. Like I said, the button being pressed or the button not being pressed or some other interaction with the hardware. And then the last 4 describe what channel it's supposed to happen on. And that's sort of left over from the old MIDI days. We're limited to 16 channels. But like I said, you actually don't really need to know any of this if you want to start messing around with hardware and doing things. You just need to know that when I press this button, I get three numbers. And if I lift my finger off of it, I probably get 3 different numbers. And if you can figure out what that means, you can start building JavaScript programs that interact with hardware in the real world. And here's a little, like, these columns represent what the MIDI standard defines for some of these different combinations of numbers. Like I said, you actually don't really need to know any of this. I just had it up there. Yeah, at the end of the day, at the end of the line, it's just an array of 3 numbers. That's all I need to know about it. And actually, we'll try it out on a different page. Maybe not this one. So what does it actually look like to use JavaScript in MIDI? So who's familiar with like other JavaScript APIs like geolocation and the webcam and other ones that require like asking permission, right? I keep forgetting this like isn't like a JavaScript conference specifically. I've gone to a lot of JavaScript conferences and talked about this. So with the MIDI protocol, it's like almost identical. You basically, you ask for permission, it returns a promise, you get a little object, you can start interacting with it. Because it's such a simple protocol, you can basically listen for events or send events to that MIDI device, and that's it. I mean, that's it. The sophistication really boils down to how complicated the device is, and also, you know, what you want to do, obviously. Couple different examples. I have a website at the end on my last slide where I've posted a lot of these examples and demos and resources and things. So if you're interested in hacking around with MIDI hardware and making your own things, you can go to that website and I'll show you. Yeah, like I said, we're just handling the received message from a MIDI controller, 3 numbers, decide what that means. There we go. There are a lot of libraries out there to make this a little bit easier. I mean, it's already pretty easy, obviously. Most of them are designed for music applications, as you would expect with a music protocol. WebMIDI.js is a good one. MIDI utils is nice if you want to start interacting with other APIs like the Web Audio API, because if you want to convert those notes into pitches and play, like make a little synthesizer or something like that, that would be a good one to use. And again, I've links to a lot of these on my site. That's it as far as what this is about. Those are the things. So now I want to show you some of these musical and non-musical things that I've made using this stack of tools. Really quick though, you can also do MIDI on the server side using Node. It's pretty similar in most ways. You don't really have to ask for permission. There's a few more interesting system level things we can do on that level. But other than that, it's, you know, as you would expect with a protocol that's basically just 3 numbers sent back and forth, it's pretty similar. Okay. So I'll show you a very quick demo. So one of the things I've done over the past year in sort of thinking about this and preparing this is I've acquired many more MIDI controllers than I used to have, and I've sort of found myself late at night like going on like AliExpress.com and buying like the cheapest MIDI controllers I could find just to see what they do and see if they work. And they show up and they often don't have very much documentation about how to use them or what they're even supposed to do exactly. And so because of that, I made this little thing that it's a very simple script. It just listens for all the MIDI controllers I've plugged into my machine. And when I push a button, it tells me what those 3 numbers are. And as goofy as this is, through trial and error, I've done this to sort of figure out my own mappings for how to use these not very well documented MIDI controllers. Or it's also useful if you buy like a really old MIDI controller that maybe you can't find documentation for. So I hit this button over here. Oh yeah. Oh, that was open in the other. Oh, I see. Okay, sorry. I didn't expect that to make sound. Yeah. So basically, when I have a MIDI controller I'm not familiar with, I tend to run this thing just to see what kind of numbers it's spitting back out at me. So here is, I mentioned earlier that there are certain utilities that make it easy to work with the Web Audio API. Here's a quick demo of a little synthesizer I built that that listens to this MIDI controller and uses the Web Audio API to. That's kind of fun. There's a lot of other fun things you can do with web audio. And if you have a more sophisticated controller like this one, I mean, this one has a lot of knobs and pads and pressure sensitive things to it, and it allows for like a different kind of interaction than just an ordinary musical keyboard. And so dials in particular are a fun user interface to play with, and dials in the real world work a lot better than dials on a computer screen. And so it's sort of fun to combine with the web audio API here. Let me get this going here. There we go. Okay, and now I can use these dials to manipulate certain attributes using the web audio API. It's kind of a fun interaction between real world hardware and this little web page I threw together. Oh, that's the wrong one. I'll leave that there. Okay, so now those are some very brief like musical examples of like sort of how the hardware is designed to be used. Now I'm going to show you the non-musical things that I built using this and talk a little bit about that. This is actually one of the very first things that I made like several years ago. Despite all this hardware and the nature of this talk, I'm actually a very analog musician at heart. I play guitar in like a little gypsy jazz band back home. That's what I like to do. We were playing a gig. We were playing at farmers markets and wineries and those kind of things. And we wanted to, for a particular performance, we wanted to have something artsy behind us, just something fun to look at, something kind of, a little out there, a little interesting. And I recently started dabbling with MIDI on my computer, and I realized I could talk to MIDI using JavaScript. And so I wrote a little program that combined with the some of the resources you can find at archive.org basically makes random poetry and art using different things that we find there. It's easier if I show you and explain it. But basically, I used this little MIDI controller down here by my feet to control the poetry that was behind us while we were playing songs and other things. It was kind of a fun interactive thing. And this was the first project that made me realize, oh, I could do a lot of very non-musical things with this stack. Let's see. Oh, come on. Well, all right. I will move on to another demo. I'm 0 for 2. That's not great. I'm sorry. I'm trying that one more time just because I'm not sure why that didn't work. That one more than the others should not have problems. All right. Well, I will just move on to the next one here. You can sort of see from this photo I took of the first one I did, but basically it creates random poems and it superimposes them on top of a video that plays behind it. If you want to track me down later, maybe I can get it to work on my computer and show it for you. It was kind of fun. This one, I'm curious, who's familiar with this movie? Who's familiar with The Goonies? A few people? Okay. The very first time I did this talk, the very first time I did this part of the talk, the very first time I had this slide in my talk, I was in another country where I didn't realize that The Goonies was a relatively American-specific experience. Like if I do this in the U.S., every single hand goes up, and I didn't realize that until I started going other places. Oh, that is not as universal of an experience as I realized. But so I had to add these slides to sort of explain the movie really quickly. There's a scene in that movie where there's a giant organ that they play made out of a skeleton, and these kids have to play the organ to escape from a trap. That's the gist of it. And I was thinking about that, and this is sort of on my bucket list of interesting stuff we could make using the stack that I'm talking about. We could get MIDI hardware and whatever to talk to one another. And so I want to show you not stuff I made, because I've not made this yet. It's my bucket list project. But some, oh wait, actually, I made a little approximation of it, but I'm not going to demo that at the moment. So could we make a real one is the question. And what we have here is we have a couple of microcontrollers like the ones I have up here in Arduinos. And they're working with servos and basically using MIDI files to dictate when the servos and motors are turning and interacting. And it's not very difficult. And it made me realize you could build the hardware that uses MIDI as the protocol to create something like the skeleton organ that opens a drawbridge when you play the right sequence of notes. And here's another one, same kind of idea. Okay, so now I'm going to move. Let's see. Yeah, I'm going to kind of just rush through the last couple demos that should work if I'm lucky. And then I'll leave maybe a couple minutes at the end for questions, as long as the question is, why didn't your demos work? Okay, so let's see. I'll do this one. Let's see. And I realize you can't see it from down there, but I have this little grid of buttons up here that I'm basically doodling on. It's just like DJ equipment, and I've just sort of repurposed it for a really simple interactive drawing tab using JavaScript. Okay. Let's do, so this one uses the one I mentioned earlier, the accelerometer that I've got here on my finger. If I can find the on button, there we go. And so what I've done is I've mapped the X, Y, and Z axes on this to the RGB values of the color that you see up on the screen. And I found this is actually kind of a fun way to sort of slowly mix the colors, slowly interact with it. I don't know, it's kind of an interesting, I think it's like a performance art like potential in that somewhere. And if I map that to HSL, you know, it behaves a little bit differently. If I keep my arm straight out like this, we have a perfectly white background. If I start to dip it down, we can see it change. And again, I just think about these things. I think about repurposing like very simple protocols that are dedicated to one thing for kind of absurd, silly things that they were never meant to do. This one, let's see here. That's better. So now you can actually see what's up here on my screen a little bit. One of the first programs I wrote when I was about 10 years old was a little ball that bounced around on the screen. And in a weird way, that's kind of become like my version of Hello World when I want to experiment with a new language and just get the gist of it and see how it works. And so I did that with MIDI and JavaScript when I was playing with these controllers and learning how they work. And so let's see, if I hit this little button here, see I have a little ball bouncing around an 8x8 grid. It bounces in a pretty regular, easy to predict pattern since 8x8 isn't very big. If I introduce a couple other balls, maybe it gets more interesting. Maybe they start bouncing off of one another. Anyway, that was kind of a fun, interactive thing to build. This one was a lot of fun also. This, so again, I'll do the same thing here. So we have just a little blue dot on the screen, and we're using the arrow keys on my keyboard. I could just move him. Oh, wait. Oh, no, I linked to the wrong one. That was not, okay, never mind. That was not what I thought it was. Okay, this one, I tell you what, I'll show you this one, and then I think I will leave a couple minutes for, for questions. And then if you're interested, I can show you some of these demos later on if you want to track me down here at the conference. So who plays Go? I'm curious. Is anyone? Are there any Go players here? How about this? Who knows the game Go? That might be a better. Okay, good. Whew. So I was looking at other ways to like repurpose this 8x8 board, and chess and checkers came to mind, and that's also something I've dabbled with and built. But you know, chess has a lot of pieces, and it's kind of hard to. You can represent it with colors, but that gets a little too abstract and hard to use. But I thought of Go, and although like a traditional small Go board is 9 by 9, I thought I could probably find a way to make 8 by 8 work. And so basically I made a fully functional, I repurposed an existing like Go library for a good chunk of it, but I made an interactive Go game that we can play on this little piece of DJ equipment here. Let's see. Donk. I'm not a very good Go player, but I also just like to get to that part. There we go. It's kind of fun. This example actually demonstrates the two-way interaction. So like I'm pushing these buttons on the hardware, and you can see that the web page is updating. It knows like what state the game is in. But I can also actually interact with it on the web page, and the hardware, if you can see here, will start to update itself also. So it was kind of a fun example to build. Let's see. And I have many, many more, but I will not subject them to you at the moment. This installation is up in Seattle, Washington, which is about 2 hours from where I live in Portland, Oregon. And I really like it because they've repurposed these. They've got billiard balls and giant steel beams and these giant steel columns, and they've repurposed these non-musical things to make a giant musical interactive exhibit. You can pluck the different billiard balls, and they create tones. There we go. And I like to end my talk with this photo, with this preview of this installation, just because like I said, I like how they've repurposed non-musical things for a musical installation, and it's sort of, in a way, part of the inspiration for what I was trying to do here, which is using music to create non-musical interactive things. Yeah, that's the end of my talk. Hvala puno. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, but I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't that many, given how some of those demos went, to be honest. Yes, okay. I think it's a raised hand.
Well,
yeah.
We have one from the bot, but I don't know, like, maybe you should elaborate. So the question was like, how do you use MIDI in IoT? And like, do you see some applications? Yes.
How is MIDI IoT?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah.
Well, I guess there was a big talk about definitions of things yesterday. I guess it depends on our definition of IoT. Like, so if you basically, so with MIDI, we can have hardware that interacts with our computer, and we can, depending on the nature of the MIDI hardware, we can make things that, here's an example of something that I made back home. I have a custom MIDI controller I made that has a thermometer on it. It knows the temperature, and it converts the temperature into a MIDI signal and sends it to my computer. And I use that as like, the world's most impractical sort of way to check the weather. But it's in line with like what a lot of other IoT hardware is doing. And I think it's interesting that such a simple protocol can be like reused in all these ways. I don't know if I answered the question exactly, but that's...
You kind of started out answering my question, actually, which is you're being a little bit demeaning to yourself. In that, actually, there's a lot of companies making programmable buttons and gesture-based devices for interacting with lights and all sorts of things. Right. And they're not expensive, but they're not cheap either. But you're basically saying here that at least with web-based technologies, you can do it yourself, really. Which actually... I think you sort of glossed around some of the really, really interesting things you could do with what you're showing here, actually. Especially the ring, like that actually has a lot of potential, I think.
The rig?
Yeah, the ability to control.
Yeah.
It has a lot of potential to control all sorts of.
Thank you. I think
interactions actually.
If there were any sort of practical application for the things I'm talking about, I feel like it lies in sort of creating things like art installations and creative things like that, or even museums. I've also found it's a really good tool for teaching kids about really basic IoT concepts. Like, so like you sort of touched on, this is like pre-existing hardware that you can go out and buy and interact with, and it's not very expensive, and there's a really low barrier to entry. It's like if you just want a button and you want to hit that button and you want stuff to happen after you hit the button, you can't get much easier than this. Like I made one of the most stupid things I made is like I played a chord and it sent an email. It's like, I don't know, it's useless, but it's interesting. Are there any other questions? I think I got 18 seconds.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess like being live with you is much better. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.